Welcome to the Sales Leaders Operating System, the podcast for sales leaders who know that success starts with strong leadership. Whether it's your first time leading a team or you're a seasoned pro, we've got the real-world advice you need to lead your team to greatness. Now, here's your host, Matt McDarby.
Hello and welcome to the Sales Leaders Operating System, the podcast for sales leaders, built by sales leaders. This is Matt McDarby. I'm your host and author, coach, and advisor to elite sales leaders all over the world. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we have an outstanding guest. Let me introduce you to them now. My next guest has an incredible 30-year career as a recruiter, sourcing and recruiting talent for companies like BAE Systems, Intelsat, MITRE, RSM McGladrey, Marriott International. He also founded and led an association for talent acquisition professionals. He's given dozens of talks and keynotes on recruiting, and today he is a principal consultant at Recruiting Toolbox, a recruitment consulting and training firm. Please welcome Ben Gotkin to the show. Ben, welcome to the Sales Leaders Operating System.
Well, thank you for having me, Matt. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I am too. You know, I talk to a lot of people on the show. Well, I talk to a lot of people in general, but I talk to a lot of people on the show, many of whom are sales leaders, either current or past sales leaders. Every so often, though, I get a chance to talk to somebody who has such deep knowledge and expertise in a topic that's relevant for the audience. I kind of get extra excited. So we're going to talk about something today: people, talent, recruitment, hiring, interviewing, that sort of range of topics. And if it's okay, I'm just going to ask you a few questions to get the conversation started so we can pull as much out of your brain as we possibly can in the next half an hour or so. Sound good?
Sounds great. Let's go.
Awesome. All right. So for those who listen to the show frequently, they know that there is this theme of systems thinking. And I'll tee up my first question by explaining, something I've said before. The best sales leaders in general, but especially sales leaders that I know and that I've observed over the years, have a system or a way of sort of making sense of all the sort of complexities, all these interconnected parts of the sales organization. And they do that so that they can diagnose, tune, right, make changes to drive better performance. Now, anyone who's listened to, at least a handful of episodes from this show knows that one of the key elements of the system of a lot of great leaders who've been on the show is people, talent. That's a recurring theme, right? Above all other elements, Matt, I've got to make sure I've got the right people in the right roles, which in my experience as a leader and as a coach and advisor to leaders is probably one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult things to do, which is to not just find, but vet and interview and hire the right people for roles. Now, you, as I said in my intro, you've been in the business of helping organizations to find and recruit and vet talent for a long time. What would you say are the most important parts of your system?
Yeah, it's a great question because, we could talk about it in terms of system, but I actually like to think in terms of structure. And I think, and having a well thought out plan and strategy that's designed to optimize speed and quality. When we can hire great talent fast, that can be productive quickly, when you have a high level of confidence they're going to be successful, that should always be the goal. That's always the target. But that's not just a given. That requires work. That requires really almost thinking in terms of almost kind of approaching a hiring situation like running a project. So it means that we, the hiring manager or, the leader in this case, whoever's making the hire, needs to get aligned with the recruiter early on what we're looking for. How long is it going to take? What level of effort is going to take? What are we actually looking for that's realistic, that we can actually feel confident we could find? Where are we going to find it? Those types of candidates. How are we going to assess them in a way that is going to give us a high level of confidence that this person could be successful in the job, on the team, in the organization? And then how do we feel confident we can actually close that candidate as well? So this is often, unfortunately, something that's not done effectively. Hiring is too often seen as a transaction. I post a job, candidate applies, I interview them, I make an offer, and maybe they'll accept, maybe they won't. And for some roles, high volume, hourly, less complex types of roles, that's actually in many cases okay. But for more complex roles, more impactful roles, that's not okay. And that's where often we might as well flip a coin to see what the results might end up being, as opposed to being highly confident that we can actually build a strategy with structure, a system, to use your terminology, that we can execute on, that could actually give us a high level of confidence that we're going to ultimately meet the goal that we'd like to meet at the end of the day.
One of the things I know that I've experienced as a leader, but I hear this a lot from leaders that I know, something that you talked about, which is, to have a plan and a strategy to acquire, and I'm paraphrasing, to acquire the right talent with speed and essentially and effectiveness, getting it right, right? So, and sometimes hiring salespeople or frontline managers can take an excruciatingly long time, even if we've done a good job of building a pipeline and we're networking all the time, and the process can take forever. So, what would you tell a leader today who's struggling with that? Like, what are where would you recommend they look? Are there things that contribute unnecessarily to the process of finding talent and making it too long? Like, what should we be doing about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Optimizing for speed is challenging. And you mentioned pipelines, building pipelines. So yeah, I think first of all, any sort of leader or hiring manager has a talent first mindset, always on the lookout for good talent. That's certainly a great way to start. But even if you have a pipeline, kind of to your point, it could still take long. Why? Well, a couple things that typically have the greatest impact on speed are unrealistic expectations around the profile of what we're looking for. Usually a combination of skills, experience, maybe even where the person worked previously, or even where they went to school. I mean, all of those things. The more that we pile on in terms of must-have requirements, and the more unrealistic it gets, it's going to take longer. And the same thing with compensation. If what we're willing to pay, or if however our compensation program is structured, is not competitive in the market, then that's could have a draw on speed as well. So that's first of all, profile compensation must be realistic. Second of all, we got once we actually start screening and interviewing candidates, we got to be highly efficient there. And that doesn't mean that we have a process where we have 10 people interviewing the candidate in multiple rounds of interviews. That's often wasteful, and it actually does not actually lead often to better hiring outcomes. It actually draws things out. We actually sometimes could lose good candidates when that part of the process takes too long. The ability to be highly efficient within the interviewing process, and not needing to see 10 candidates to make a decision, but maybe even 2 or 3 if we feel confident they're really good, and feel confident to actually make the decision at the end of the day, as opposed to just feeling like we need to see or interview more to feel like to avoid kind of fear of missing out, right? The FOMO that sometimes gets into play too. So I think a high level of confidence and good structure in the interviewing and selection process is also critical to optimizing for speed. Those 2 areas is where I tend to see the bottlenecks. And those are things often under the hiring manager and leader's control: how we're defining the role, what we're willing to pay, and the process we're going to use to assess talent. Those are all things we can make decisions on around in a way that can help us to go faster.
There are a few things that you said there I want to just drill down into a little further. And the way I captured it was, we have to have a high level of confidence in the process. So you're a talent acquisition recruitment professional who could do this in his sleep. You've probably forgotten more about this topic than most people know. And let's face it, a lot of, again, I'm very sales focused in my commentary here, but a lot of senior sales leaders do view the hiring process in a fairly transactional way, right? So there's 2 things. So it's high level of confidence in the process, but also I'm inferring here, we also have to have a high level of confidence in the profile that we've created. We have to know that what we're looking for is the right thing. And I'm thinking about both of those. I'm like, boy, those are huge obstacles potentially, because we have managers who don't pay enough attention to the process to be really fully confident in it, and don't give enough time to spell out the expectations for the role. So how could we possibly be
Mhm.
confident in the profile? So what do you do
Right.
about that? This is maybe about partnering with leaders. Like, how do you resolve that sort of an issue? Because that's tough.
Well, I think that ultimately our goal here in the assessment process is to predict success. And so, how do we do that? Well, I mean, we got we need to look back and what have been examples of our most successful performers. What are the characteristics of our most successful performers that we'd want to be able to assess and that could kind of help define that profile. And I often find, especially with sales roles, as I've worked with a lot of sales recruiters as well as trained a lot of sales leaders. So often in sales, it comes down to behaviors. Yeah, I mean, Matt, tell me. I mean, what would you say are some of the most common characteristics of the most successful salespeople, especially as it may relate to behaviors?
Yeah, well, behaviors, great listeners, right? They ask not just surface level questions, but clarifying questions, right? Listening skills. They're really listening to understand. And I guess the third thing would be they are really effective at linking what they have to offer with what matters most to the customer. Those are kind of the three biggies, right?
Right. Yeah, and I also think things like persistence, that's often a big one. And so I think that as we think about that, first of all, how are we defining that, and then how would we get evidence of that behavior in the interview? What kind of question could we ask? Usually, like things like behavioral interviewing questions are usually typically great examples of that. Tell me about a time when had to combine, had to really understand what the client was looking for and tie that back to what you had to offer them, or, just off the top of my head, throwing out something like that. Or maybe you could do a role play in those types of situations, see how the candidate would react and interact with you in a very real world type of scenario situation. It's also a very effective interviewing technique, but it starts with being very clear on what we're actually looking for, what we're actually want to assess in the first place. And being very and recognizing that we're not going, it's rare when we're going to find perfection. Okay, right? Yes, we would like to find candidates that have it all the skills, all the behaviors, all the prior accomplishments, and all the right motivations and all those things, and that should always, and that we could afford a candidate like that as well, and the candidate would want to come work for us as well. All those things should be ultimately what we want. We also got to recognize that I think it's helpful to do so up front. Is where can and should we be willing to be flexible? There probably are some of those core behaviors where you should not be willing to be flexible. The candidates must have these behaviors because we know that is what's linked to their success in this organization, on this team, doing what we need them to do. And so I think that critical thought really needs to be there on the front end. We actually like to talk about that recruiting toolbox as hiring criteria. What is the hiring criteria for this particular role? Usually a mix of skills, behaviors, motivators, and maybe even some prior accomplishments. And then once we've defined those clearly and we've determined who on the interview team is going to get evidence of that and what questions are they going to ask, and we're all aligned on that, we're all clear on that, that is what actually leads to a high level of confidence. What doesn't lead to a high level of confidence? Going to an interviewing situation, just kind of winging it, or walk me through your resume, or just tell me about your greatest accomplishment, and not really digging in and making that very much a conversation and going really deep. I find actually that particularly, and this is particularly true with sales hires, and I'm curious if what your experience has been with this yourself, but I find when sales hires don't work out, those are often false positive hiring outcomes, meaning that we thought this person was going to produce more than they did, or they thought we were going to be productive or generate sales more quickly than they did.
Yeah.
And the number one driver of that is not necessarily the candidate. It's not necessarily the candidate's fault. It's actually on the interviewers. It's that they didn't go deep enough. Okay, or they got a surface level answer and then they moved on to the next question without really understanding clearly what the candidate did in that scenario, what their role was, what impact they had on results, what the big obstacle or challenge was that they had to face. And that in particular. If I were to think of like one of the greatest questions you can ask a salesperson in an interview is, tell me about the hardest deal you ever had to close and what made it so hard. What did you do to overcome that, the objection or the long process, or what did what obstacle did you have specifically did you have to come? What did you specifically do to accomplish that? What was your impact on the results?
Yeah.
And that's really good interviewing. Is when we can really go. We like to talk about that as the secret sauce of great interviewing.
Yeah.
Right. It's the ability to really dig deep and probe, because you might find out in that conversation, hey, the candidate looked amazing on paper. They had all these great accomplishments, exceeded quota, President's Club, all those things that, that you typically would see on a resume of what we would be looking for in a high performing salesperson. But maybe what we find out is in that, most recent situation that it was easy to close those deals.
Yeah.
That they had they had a support structure in place that they would not have if they're, in coming to work for us. And so, in getting into the details, I'd be much more interested in a candidate that has overcome the types of obstacles or dealt with the types of challenges or worked within the type of structure or system similar to what we have. That would give us a lot more confidence that this person not is just a successful salesperson, but could be a successful salesperson here.
Yeah.
And that's the key. That's what builds confidence.
Yeah. So you said a few things here I want to keep digging into and this resonates with me, stings a little bit personally, because I'm like a lot of, I've hired a lot of people over the years, right? And I think about the times when I don't want to say hired the wrong people, but hired people who were not going to be successful in the role that we defined. And in those scenarios where we did do an effective job of defining the profile, we knew what behavior we were going to be looking for. In those scenarios where we still didn't select the right people, it is because, as you put it, we didn't go deep enough. We made assumptions, right? And I think about it's interesting because there's an old tome in professional selling. People say, time kills all deals. And every time I hear that, I'm like, no, that's actually not it. Assumptions kill deals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We make assumptions about the timeline, about the decision process, about what mattered to key people, about how many people were involved, who they were, all of that. Those are the things that kill deals. I think we can add assumptions kill great hires, right? Or they prevent great hires here because there may be things that we didn't do in our process and we just sort of filled in the blanks. The one thing that I see a lot of is this person had a lot of success working for a competitor. Ergo, they're going to be successful here, right? Yeah, and I've seen dozens of examples where that definitely did not play out. It was the opposite. People were like the point you were making. They knew how to be successful in another environment, but this is about success here, different environment. It doesn't matter if they were selling something similar, right? Yeah. So for those listening, right, a key point here we've made in a different context or several different contexts is we cannot make assumptions about important things. And this also applies to the hiring process.
Well, and it's assumptions that are particularly those assumptions that are driven by bias.
Sure.
And like, for example, that, they worked at somebody else, they were successful. It could be a pedigree bias. Okay. That we overvalued the fact that they were successful in another organization. So we assume they're going to be successful here. Subjectivity around things like, my gut is telling me no or yes or no. I think they're a good culture fit, or things that just aren't well defined and that might be driving assumptions that can also cause that could raise the risk. I mean, there's a risk in every hire you're going to make, but the more poor assumptions that we make, the more bias or subjectivity that's not addressed, that it's influencing decisions, and our risk goes up and up and up. And that's something that's controllable if we're intentional.
And those biases, there's a lot of them, right? They could be, they look and sound a lot like me. They went to a great school. They went to my school. They know so-and-so who came highly recommended, and on, right?
Well, and I'll give you a really good example of where I ran into that in a training class situation. I was a few years back. I was in Ohio, had a client, a room full of regional sales directors, probably 60 regional sales directors. That was actually too big of what we would typically have for a training class, but that's what we had to work with. And at the very opening of the workshop, the VP of sales got up and he said, "I want everybody to take a look around here. Does this room, who's in this room, does this look like who we're trying to sell to?" And people were kind of looking around, and people were kind of like, "Nah, probably, yeah." And obviously the VP of sales, knew what the answer was. Like, no, they did not. It was, and a lot of the way that sales team had been grown over the years was a lot of hiring a lot of hiring people that came from that same type of background and same kind of pedigree. And so you had a very homogenous sales team that did not necessarily look like or relate too well who they were trying to sell to. So the VP was framing this, hey, you know what, we need diversity of thought. We need to build up sales team that can relate very well to who we're trying to sell to. And that means we probably need to rethink a little bit of the profile of what we're looking to hire for. And we need to kind of throw some of those old assumptions like best athlete, the quarterback is going to be, I've always hired a quarterback as they've always thought they're going to be a great salesperson kind of mentality out the window. Because, maybe that isn't necessarily who my target is in terms of who I'm trying to sell to.
Yeah.
That's who.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but I thought that I love that because I think that was a very progressive and proactive and thoughtful way around, hey, hiring and how we structure our teams can have a very direct impact on our bottom line. Right. And our ability to be effective in meeting our sales goals in this particular case.
Sales management can be the most difficult and thankless job if you don't manage your time and your team effectively. I'm Matt McDarby, and my proven Cadence Tuning Framework, or CT Scan for short, has transformed sales leaders at hundreds of companies, including ADP, Equitable, McGraw-Hill, and Medtronic. Get the CT Scan free at salesmanagers.news. Well, I'll go back to something you were talking about earlier. And incidentally, I've written about this before, which is the idea that we need to look for evidence of the behavior that we need in this role. I've been hired and run hiring processes in several places where it was not just the behavioral interviewing, but it was the simulation. Here's a scenario, take us through, right? We want to see how you do it. Why? Because we're looking for evidence that you're doing things like asking good questions, listening, connecting what you heard with things that matter to us. So the simulations are key. Ultimately, that's the great equalizer here, I think, regardless of demographic and where people come from and who recommended them is, can they demonstrate or can we see evidence that they can execute the behavior we need here, which goes to our process for figuring out what that behavior is in the first place, right? So this is a little bit of a question out of left field, and I want to hear if there's any other kind of big lessons learned. But I'm curious, and you don't have to name names or tools or anything in particular unless you have something in mind. But I'm curious about your opinion about profiling tools, hiring profiles and assessments, and this sort of thing we put people through to understand how they think or what their personality is like, or do they demonstrate behavior in certain situations. What's your feeling in general about the role of those kinds of assessments in hiring?
They need to be really well thought out, first of all. And I've been in organizations like, for example, I spent a couple of years at Marriott International. We had a whole team of industrial psychologists that all they did was validate and assess our assessments and our pre-screening questions, job descriptions, all that. There are some, when the assessments are used that are not validated, there actually could be some legal risk associated with that. But also we got to question really the impact of that those assessments are having on our decisions at the end of the day. I think it could be a data point, sometimes even in screening purposes, especially more high volume screening purposes. Assessments can be helpful in kind of narrowing the funnel. But once you actually get into the interview and assessment stage, it should be maybe a piece of the puzzle, a data point that is combined with evidence that we're actually getting in the interview itself as well. So I think, interestingly, it's a great question because when I first started my career, I was at a mid-size electrical product distributor in the Mid-Atlantic, and we used an assessment tool called the Predictive Index,
Yep, I know.
PI.
Yep.
And one of the things that I remember back from then, because I was hiring salespeople back then, both inside and outside salespeople, is that one of the things we would look at is kind of introversion versus extroversion. And, I think that's sometimes actually led to some poor assumptions that, okay, an extrovert's going to be, they're extroverted, so they should be a more effective salesperson. What I didn't realize until years later, and there's a great book called The Rare Find by an author, George Anders, where he lays out a whole case study around, introverted versus extroverted salespeople. Who's better? The common assumption or the conventional wisdom is that extroverts are better salespeople. Well, the data actually shows that introverts can and often sometimes are better salespeople. Why? Because better listeners, naturally. Okay. But here's where an assessment was actually leading me and hiring leaders in maybe a different direction, maybe actually ruling out the introvert or which can show up in an interview as not being, over the top energetic, or not showing a whole lot of motivation for the job, or being a little initially nervous or a little uncomfortable in the situation. Well, introverts can be like that. It doesn't necessarily mean they can't be a great salesperson. So that's where we got to be careful too. And what are we really, how are the results really impacting what really matters and counts in the person's ability to do the job? Sometimes assessments can be pretty good on target or give you some additional evidence to help, kind of build that confidence that we'd like to have. But in a vacuum, I'd be kind of nervous about the impact sometimes those assessments might have if we're not really clear and intentional, and if we haven't really been confident this is truly valid to help us assess a candidate for this role.
I'll summarize all this by saying hirer beware, right? You have to know how you're using them. Is this a validated assessment? I'll just add, incidentally, my experience with hiring assessments, profiling tools is we tend to use them to validate conclusions we've already drawn about people.
Yeah.
Right. And I've seen plenty of situations where the technically valid assessment tool tells us X, where we observed Y in the hiring process. And we're like, yeah, but we saw Y. So we're going to throw the assessment out today. Right. So then I'm like, well, why are we using it at that point? Right.
Well, interestingly, the same holds true with reference checks. Rarely do reference checks ever change a hiring decision. But often it's still embedded within the process. And the thing with reference checks and even assessments, if we think about it from the candidate's perspective, the candidate experience, if we're asking the candidate to complete a lengthy assessment, candidates that need a job, they'll do whatever you ask them to do. Candidates that are super busy and don't necessarily need your job, we found them, we invited them to come in, their tolerance for doing more stuff like assessments, that goes down. And especially if they don't really need your job, they're maybe less likely to be willing to do something like that. And that shouldn't necessarily be held against them if, in those situations. Whereas reference checks, the challenge, the risk there is that, two things. First of all, is that can often drag out the amount of time. Candidates, especially if they got multiple offers or interviewing with other organizations, they may not be willing to wait for you if you are taking a couple weeks to complete reference checks. But even, if I got a conversation with my wife about this recently, said, around the topic of kind of backdoor references. Like, not a fan at all, because that's also something that candidates don't really appreciate, that you went behind my back to talk to somebody, I'm currently working with or worked with previously, to get insight into my background, which may or may not have added any value anyway. And that can be a real turnoff. And so that's why I typically, would say, hey, just be really critical about whether you really need references. How often do they really change a decision? And never do backdoor references.
Good call. Right. That's good counsel. All right. I said at the top, I was going to ask you one question to see where it took us. And lo and behold, here we are. We've gotten deep into a range of things already. So I'm going to ask you kind of another question, just about any other lessons that you've learned about great hiring or making it a great process. Anything you haven't shared so far where you're like, I think the other big lesson is, what would that be?
I think it's just come with a lifetime, 30 plus years of experience in recruiting and I started to experience what I'm about to say here in places like the MITRE Corporation and RSM and places like that. But I talk about it a lot now in our client work. And I think the key to success for most organizations, whether it's something systematic across the entire organization or whether it's the hiring manager's mindset, is building a recruiting culture. And there's so many parallels between recruiting and
Sure.
sales. And one of the things I always like to think back to is, of course, that great scene in Glengarry Glen Ross, always be closing, the ABC. Well, always be recruiting.
Sure.
If you simply are just waiting for the need to arise before you start looking for talent, timing is. I said timing, before timing kills all deals. Well, timing is also one of the most important and typically unappreciated variables in recruiting and hiring. And, whether it's the sales leader, the hiring leader, the hiring manager, however we want to classify that, or anybody on the team, we need to embed a always be recruiting mindset. And especially in sales, we know very likely who the best salespeople are at our talent competitors. Okay. Have we ever approached them, or do we even have them on in our radar as someone that we want to talk to about potentially recruiting them to come here, whether they're interested in making a move at that very moment or not? Again, great recruiting is about relationships. It's about timing, but you talked about a system before. Great organizations that really excel in recruiting, they get the best hires consistently, is they are always thinking about that next hire. And whenever I run into great talent, I know what to say. I know how to get them interested and engaged about the possibility of coming to work here. Maybe even talk to them about referrals. If they might want to refer somebody to me. It's unfortunately something that's often missing, and this is kind of going back to where we're talking about recruiting is seen as transactional. Well, if it's purely transactional in an organization, then that's almost missing entirely. That always be recruiting mindset. It's truly seen as a transaction. But if we think about it systematically, and especially in sales, is that I should be willing to pull the trigger to hire a great salesperson anytime. Yeah. Okay. Because, I would never want to miss out on that opportunity. Right. And I think that's the key to success. That really is the key to success. And obviously we still have to work within budgets and hiring cycles and parameters and things like that. But just the mentality alone, whether, I ideally like to think that starts from the very top and flows down. But I think where I've seen the best hiring managers the best hiring managers take ownership over that, and they're always looking for great talent. Because they're going to hire again at some point. They're going to need someone like that at some point. Let's not wait till the actual need arises to act on it.
If we think about hiring, it's a process, and then there are some skills associated with it, right? It's like anything else that's important. If we don't practice it all that often, right? It's like me when I go to the golf course. Every year I start the year, I'm like, I'm going to try to play like 15 rounds. And it's July. I've gotten 2 rounds. I go out and play, and I'm horrible. I suck at it. I'm like, whacking the ball back and forth over the green. I'll end the golf analogy there. But the point is, it's like any other important skill. If you're not practicing it, isn't it safe to assume that your skills are atrophying there? So if you think about the sort of leaders that are they're in the always be recruiting mode, is there what are the top couple, 1 or 2 things that they are doing that average leaders are not?
Well, again, what I mentioned previously is they take ownership over hiring process. They're not just throwing it to HR and recruiting and expecting them to do all the work. They take ownership over thinking critically around what a good hire would look like, where I should be willing to be flexible, what's realistic in terms of what I can hire, what good looks like in the role. So just kind of understanding that clearly and having reasonable expectations around that. That's a good start. Someone who not just themselves, but empowers their team to go out and always be looking for talent. So we're just, an old boss of mine used to use the term all the time. Hiring is a team sport.
Sure.
It's absolutely true. But then also, I think they're just naturally good at assessing talent too, and that's where we often see a big challenge is that. And actually, I like the golf analogy because what happens if you just pick somebody off the street who's never played golf before and you put them on a golf course? Are they actually going to be able to do anything successful on a golf course?
Probably not.
No, it's a
Right.
skill. You have to put time, and it's actually a really hard skill. Interviewing, actually being a great interviewer and assessor of talent, it isn't actually that hard of a skill. But the problem is that very little, or very few organizations have put ample time and effort into training their managers and their interviewers on how to be effective managers and interviewers, the types of skills that it takes to be successful in doing that. It is they're important skills. Again, for some it comes naturally. For many, it needs to be a learned skill. And this is one of the cores of our business is teaching client companies on how to be effective interviewers, basic and advanced interviewing skills. A lot of some of the things we've been talking about here on this podcast. And and what I really love is when I get into those situations, and I find managers and interviewers who have been interviewing maybe for a long time, but didn't always have a high level of confidence, or was wondering, was always curious, why don't I make better hires? And now they're getting insights into, okay, well, I wasn't going deep enough in this area, or I wasn't being clear enough on how I was defining what I was looking for. Or I wasn't even doing a good job, and I was maybe not even doing a good job of selling the job and the opportunity to the candidate. I assumed that they just would want to come work here. And all those things could, when we get better at that and we practice those things and we see the results and how it turns into better hires, faster hires, more confidence in the hiring decisions, that's a game changer.
Yeah.
And that's where, if you look at the industries that do exceedingly well in these sort of things, professional services firms, the big four, the Accentures, the big tech companies, Amazon, Google, Meta, Apple, those organizations have had structured interview training programs in place for many, many years. In fact, many organizations like that actually refer to it as a license to hire. That you actually need to go through this training before we're even going to allow you to interview candidates. But I think that's a good idea. I think that companies that think that way and make those things mandatory and recognize that these are skills we want our managers and interviewers to have, those are the ones that get better results. It's not no accident that for years in the height of big techs in their glory days, that they were making better quality and faster quality hires. It wasn't just the name. It's that they had trained interviewers and managers that were better, more consistently at interviewing. Whether you're hiring engineers or salespeople or whatever. This is what smart organizations think about, and if they really value people. Everybody says they do, right?
Sure.
Yeah. They all say it, but if they need to back it up with, hey, are we giving the managers, our interviewers, the skills, the tools, the resources to be successful and confident in making great hires consistently and fast? Okay. It doesn't just happen.
For the people listening, leaders of leaders, frontline managers listening to the show, we should be thinking about, are we practicing these skills or not? And if we don't know or don't even know how to create the environment where we could learn and practice these skills, where's this guy Ben? Where can I find him, right? So Recruiting Toolbox, right? Ben, and it's Gotkin. Look him up, right? Because there's a reason that they're doing what they're doing, is these are such critical skills. And if we don't practice them, how the heck could we possibly be effective at them? It's not.
You might as well flip a coin. Might as well flip a coin at the end of the day when it comes to hiring decisions.
Yeah, and these are expensive, high impact decisions. All right, one last question, Ben. In the interest of time, I ask a kind of a purposely open and vague question at the end, which is, what else? What else do we need to know? It could be a challenge you've overcome and a way to do it. It could be something you've learned from. Could be another idea, something maybe you think would be helpful, knowing what you know about our audience. So what else, Ben?
I'll throw something out there, and I think that particularly if we have our sales hats on, I like to tell because I'm pretty blunt when I'm speaking with leaders in client companies or just leadership in general, is nobody needs your job. When we're at record low unemployment today, great talent is employed. The best talent typically they could work anywhere, right? I mean, the opportunities exist out there. So, we can never assume that somebody is going to just come to work for us because of who we are. But there's so many parts of the hiring process and cycle. The candidate experience is a term that's used and thrown around a lot in our circles these days. It's really critical. We like to put in our workshops managers and interviewers through a little exercise on what are the characteristics of a great candidate experience. Things like, how are we positioning just even the job and the job posting itself? How are we, what is that candidate's experience when they're actually interviewing with us? In terms of what would we like actually candidates to say about that experience that would be positive? And there are things like, are we setting clear expectations with candidates about what our process is like, what they're going to experience, how long it's going to take, when we're going to get back to them? Are we getting back to them quickly? One of the things, if you want to kill your candidate experience, if you want to really piss off your candidates, take 2 or 3 weeks to get back to them after the interview with your decision. The best talent doesn't need to, they're not going to, they have low tolerance for that. They're not going to wait for that, nor should they. Were the questions that they were asked in the interview good, relevant questions? Did it feel conversational? Or did it feel like, an interrogation, or they asked totally pointless, silly questions that, the candidate was probably scratching their head wondering, what are they even talking about in the first place? Did the interviewer, even HR, get a good understanding of what the candidate's real motivators were? And did they sell to those motivators, or did I just get the generic boilerplate pitch on why you should come work here? Those are things that often are overlooked in the interview process. But if I like to teach managers and interviewers to be really good at sales here, and that includes the experience that they're going through. That includes how we're tailoring our sell to what matters to that candidate. And, if it's just a very generic process and a very generic pitch, you're not always going to get the best talent with that.
I'm looking back at something else you said earlier about, we were talking about optimizing for speed, but there were a couple of other things, a couple of things that you said to connect directly back to this candidate experience. And screening and hiring must be efficient, and we have to have a high level of confidence in the process. That candidate experience, we have to understand what people are going through, and we have to help them step through it efficiently, which means managers, if you're listening and you're not taking ownership of the process or not paying attention closely enough to be able to explain to that great candidate you'd love to hire so that they can understand what to expect from where they're on the process now all the way to the end, huge missed opportunity. You've got to understand that well enough to be able to explain it to that top talent you're trying to bring in, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's key. It's key to our success. And I mean, especially as long as we're in a candidates market, and we are still in a candidates market, especially for top talent. For top talent, we're always in a candidate market, even when the unemployment numbers go up or we feel like hiring is down. Top talent is always in demand. So if you really want top talent, then you got to be intentional. You got to have a good system, good strategy, good plan to execute on that. And there's those skills, particularly those sales skills that we need to employ to in those situations as well. And we've got to have a great process. We have great candidate experience. We got to be intentional and thoughtful about that. Otherwise, again, flip a coin in terms of what those results might be.
Awesome. All right, Ben, what I'm going to now try to do after I let you go is summarize some of the big ideas and challenge our audience to think about how do you apply these things. And again, I really do want to encourage, if you've never had any sort of structured training around recruitment, interviewing skills especially, please do go check out Ben on LinkedIn and look at his firm. They can definitely help. Ben, we could have gone on for another hour or more on this topic if it's okay.
Yeah.
I would love to have you come back and have a kind of a mini panel conversation a few months down the line, because this topic of talent and recruitment is going to resonate with this audience. And I've got other people who I think have not exactly the same but somewhat divergent views about talent. I think we should challenge each other on some of these things. I'd love to have you back for that if you're open to it.
Would be very open
Awesome.
to that.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, Ben, thanks so much. Great to have you with us. I'm going to get to my summary now. So what can we learn from Ben and all of his experience? He's got this very sort of programmatic approach to recruitment. I just think there's so much to learn here. Maybe I'm projecting, and I think I said it during my conversation with Ben, but I've always found I haven't made horrible hires, but I have missed, and I've always suspected that there was something about our process for hiring, for vetting people, not just bringing them in for the first interview, but beyond the first interview, and really making sure that we're clear about whether they can be successful in the role. And personally, I've had, hiring processes that ranged from highly engineered, with assessments and profiles and a lot of data to, kind of thumb in the air, guesswork, which is obviously not optimal. But when you listen to Ben's description of what kind of building a recruiting culture looks like, you realize it's kind of neither of those, right? We're not talking about overly engineered processes that are complex and take too long. He actually talked about optimizing our process for acquiring talent for speed, optimizing for speed, and gave us some pointers on, how to do that. Also, with an efficient process, we may be thinking, boy, there's risk we're gonna miss something, right? We're not gonna have the right people. Well, I think the point here is that if we know we make bad hires when we didn't go deeply enough into dialogue with the candidates that we're considering for open roles, that's something we have to fix. Go deeply enough so that we can discover if they're a good match, but also they can help us to discover if they have the capability to be successful in the role that we're making available. So looking at his system, Ben said some things that I think are, they're sort of apparent. Right? In order, to have a system for recruitment, you really have to have a plan and a strategy to acquire talent with speed and effectiveness. I think that's one of those we all nod and say, yep, absolutely, we should do that. How many companies really do that? Does yours? If you look at your approach for acquiring talent, do you do so efficiently and effectively? Is your process optimized for speed? Is it a good experience for candidates? Are you really going deeply enough into dialogue to evaluate whether people really are a fit or not? Are you looking at this like a project, right? That has a beginning and an end and a whole bunch of steps that you have to complete successfully, a whole bunch of milestones that must be completed before you can consider the job done. My head is sort of spinning here. I'm thinking about all of the things that I've done in the past, sometimes well, sometimes not, that have led to recruitment being maybe a lot harder than it needed to be. So I hope you enjoyed listening to Ben's insights. I will have him back for a group conversation at some point down the line. He's just got so much more to offer here. My next guest, I would love to have you join us and hear our conversation about marketing and sales, really revenue alignment. And he's got an interesting perspective coming at this from a marketer's perspective, but lots to learn. And I hope you will join us for that next conversation. In the meantime, I'm Matt McDarby, host of the Sales Leaders Operating System podcast. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye for now.